All right. So these are the things that we'll be looking at. Okay, we'll look at the King's aggregate demand schedule. Okay, and then initially the analysis that we were doing, we were just assuming that the price level was fixed. That is why in the money market, the nominal quantity of money was exactly equal to the real quantity of money. But here we'll try and relax that assumption. Then we'll look at how to use the ISLM to derive the aggregate demand schedule. Then we'll combine this aggregate demand schedule with a vertical aggregate supply curve. Okay. Then we'll look at the contractual view of the labor market. Now, based on the vertical AS, there was an assumption that wages and prices move equiproportionally. So if wage increases by 20%, then we expect wage to also increase by 20%. But then under Keynes' model, we'll realize that wage doesn't really move as it was previously assumed. So we'll look at a model where a wage doesn't really move. Even if it moves, it won't be able to be exactly equal to the increase in price, at least in percentage-wise. So we'll look at that. Then we'll look at a model where prices can freely move, but then wage is held constant. Then we'll look at what those monetary and then fiscal policies will do to the general price level and then the aggregate output. Okay, so we'll quickly look at all those things. Now, for the aggregate demand, the main focus is to look at the relationship between price and then the output level. Okay, so when we talk about the aggregate demand curve, it's just a curve that is talking about the relationship between price and aggregate output. So how exactly are we going to do this? We'll look at how changes in price will affect the output level by going through the ISLM. And we know that for that model, there's equilibrium in both markets, the goods market and then the money market. So whenever there are changes in price, the effect on the output level will go through simultaneous equilibrium in both the goods and then the money market. In other words, we will be using the ISLM to do that. Now, before Keynesian economics, the economic belief was that the government shouldn't intervene in the affairs of the economy, and they believed in the self-adjusting nature of the economy. That is why they believe that whenever there's an increase in price, a certain percentage increase in price, they should just allow the market, the nominal or the money wage will also increase by the same percentage, and as a result, the economy will come back to equilibrium. But Keynes was having a different thought. According to him, it is not always like that, and believing in the self-adjusting nature of the economy was totally wrong. So he tried to bring out the idea that we need a theory of aggregate demand to actually know what happens to output. So he championed those monetary and then the fiscal policy. So if you want to know the output level, we shouldn't just allow the economy to do that. We have to use aggregate demand if we want to stimulate output. Don't just leave the economy believing that per its own self, things will get back to normal. So he championed policies that will stimulate aggregate demand. And by policies, we are talking about fiscal policy, where he said we should use changes in government spending and taxes to affect output level. And then per monetary to changes in the quantity of money could also do that. So that is what we will be looking at now. Now, when we looked at the ISLM, we saw that whenever there are changes in those autonomous components, we see a change in the output level. It goes through all those mechanisms that we now know. But that is not enough. Just going through the ISLM model isn't enough to actually make us know what exactly is happening to GDP. So before then, when we're looking at the ISLM, we just made some assumptions about the aggregate supply curve. Okay. Now we'll have to relax some of those assumptions. So if we are dealing with aggregate demand and not just the ISLM, then we should actually know the shape of the aggregate supply curve. Okay. So we want to deal with AD and then AS. We combine them, and then we know what will actually happen whenever we enact those policies. We are not just going to, we saw what happens to Y and all that when we're dealing with the ISLM, but we are going beyond that to look at the various shapes of the AS curve, and then whenever there are changes in aggregate demand, how it actually affects the output level. But what we need to understand is that the effect of any policy will depend on the assumption that we are making about the AS curve. Okay, the AS curve can take these forms. It can be vertical, it can be horizontal. That is where price is held constant, and then it can also be sloping upwards, where price is allowed to freely move. So we'll look at the effect of these policies when the AS curve takes any of these forms. Okay, but first we have to go through the ISLM. Then we'll know what is going to happen to aggregate demand whenever there are changes in those fiscal and then monetary policy variables. We get to aggregate demand, and by changing the aggregate demand in the ADAS model, we'll be able to know the effect of those policies on output and then the general price level. Okay, the general price level. So let's look at what we already know. Before we started with the ISLM, with the introduction of Keynesian economics, we said the economy was in equilibrium when aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure was identical to the income level. Okay, so AD was exactly supposed to be the same as Y. Now here the assumption is that given the price level, producers will be waiting to see the quantity of demand, the quantity of aggregate demand in the economy. Then they will produce according to that particular demand. So it was like supply was demand determined. It will always wait to see what the various economic agents are willing to demand. Then holding price constant, then the producers too will offer that particular quantity for sale. So here we're holding price constant. Okay, price was constant, and then whatever quantity that we offer for sale will just depend on the quantity that the economic agents were buying. So whenever there was an increase in aggregate demand, even at the same price, we see an increase in the general output level. So for that case, we're assuming the horizontal nature of the AS curve. But what if the AS curve isn't horizontal, which means that the relationship between price and then the output is different from what we initially saw. So here price won't be constant. When we allow price to vary, then what exactly is going to happen to this model? So that is what we want to look at. Initially, price was fixed. So this is the fixed price Keynesian AS curve. Okay, so it doesn't matter the quantity that they offer for sale. Price was constant. So this is what I was saying. If demand was at this point, then the producers were willing to offer this quantity for sale. If there should be an increase in demand, then we see an increase in the quantity that they produce as well. So the output level wasn't a function of price. It didn't depend on price at all. They were just waiting to see the quantity that the various economic agents were willing to buy. Then they will also act accordingly. But what if we now allow price to vary? If price is not constant, then what is going to happen to the AS schedule? That is what we want to look at now. Okay. Right. So we will have to derive the aggregate demand curve or schedule. Okay. So what we do is that we combine ISLM, which means that before we can get the aggregate demand schedule, there's supposed to be equilibrium in both the money and then the output market. So getting aggregate demand, we are talking about the demand side of the economy, and also we are no longer holding price constant. Okay, we are not holding price constant. So here we'll try to look at the impact of the two policies, monetary and then fiscal policy. Then based on the shape of the AS curve, we'll be able to know the impact of these monetary and then fiscal policies on price and then the output level. So first we'll go through ISLM. We determine our aggregate demand curve. Then based on the shape of the AS curve, we'll be able to get the effect of maybe an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy or a contractionary monetary or fiscal policy on price and then the output. Right, this is just a recap. This is just a recap. We are coming to use the ISLM. So this is just refreshing our minds on what they are. We know the IS curve is derived from the output market, the values of interest rate and then income that ensures equilibrium in the output market. And then for LM, we are talking about the money market. So interest rate and income that will ensure equilibrium in the money market. And then for fiscal policies, we are talking about changing government expenditure and taxes. And we saw that whenever G changes or T changes, it affects the IS curve. The IS curve will shift either to the right or left, depending on the kind of change. And then we also saw that for monetary policy, we are talking about changes in the quantity of money, and that one shapes the LM curve. We also looked at the determinants of the slopes of the IS and then the LM curves, and I'm sure you remember all those things. Remember, it was the slope that we were using for the policy effectiveness. Okay, and we also went through the algebra to get equilibrium Y and then I. So far, those are the things that we have done. This is just the algebra, something that we already know. So let's not waste time here. Right, remember the slopes of the IS and then the LM curves. For the IS, we saw it dependent on the interest sensitivity of investment or interest elasticity of investment, and then the B, the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so I don't know how the questions are going to be like. I don't know if there's going to be true or false, but if you have true or false, then they normally talk about this ones, the effectiveness and then the slope of the curves. So you need to know the variables that actually affect the slope of the IS. So we know the interest sensitivity of investment and then the MPC. You don't have to chew them. Okay, you just have to look at these ones. Okay, this is slope minus 1 minus B over V. So you know that B affects the slope, V also affects the slope. Then you think about it, is it affecting it in a positive way or in a negative way? Just by looking at this, you should be able to know that, so that you don't have to chew all these things. And then the slope of the LM curve depends on interest sensitivity of money demand and the income sensitivity of money demand. So you know this one as well. Right, now for you to get the aggregate demand schedule, what you do is that when you solve for the equilibrium income and then interest rates, remember when we're solving for the equilibrium income and interest rates, you put interest rates into income. Okay, so that's exactly what we do here. The initial one that we did, we assumed price to be constant. Price was constant, but now we are relaxing that assumption. So if we are solving for Y and you substitute this LM curve here, this R, into the IS curve, then you realize that income will now be a function of M over P. So income will be a function of price. So whenever there are changes in price, we expect a change in income. What I'm trying to say is that if you put this out here, I don't know why here they were using I, okay, but it's the same interest rate. Okay, now if you put this here, now you realize that Y will depend on P. So that relationship between Y and P is what we are going to use to derive the aggregate demand. Initially, we didn't talk about that because price was constant. Price wasn't changing at all, so we couldn't get any relationship between income Y and then the price P. But now that price is changing, how do we actually do that? So now, if you put the R into the Y, this is the general equilibrium Y, okay, in terms of all the variables. You realize that Y here, this YE here, is also a function of M over P. Okay, so whenever there are changes in M over P, we should expect a change in E. Whenever there's a change in government spending, we should expect a change in E. Whenever there's a change in tax, we should expect a change in Y. All these ones, if there's a change in autonomous consumption, it should affect Y. If there's a change in autonomous investment, it should affect Y. But we are only taking G, T, and M because these are the policies. G and T is for fiscal, and then M over P is for the monetary. So in a more general way, we will say that the income level is a function of real money balance, the M over P, real money supply, and then government spending and taxes. The signs here, they just talk about the relationship between Y and these components. M over P being positive means that whenever there's an increase in real quantity of money, there should be an increase in Y. Whenever there's an increase in government spending, it should result in an increase in Y. Whenever there's an increase in tax, because the sign is negative, it should result in a reduction in Y. So now that we want to get an aggregate demand curve, we want to look at what happens to Y whenever there's a change in P. So when we're able to get that relationship, that is what is going to give us the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so Y is a function of M over P. But we will be holding M constant, J constant, T constant. If we change P, how does it affect Y? But before we get the effect on Y, we need to go through the ISLM. Okay, so we know from the ISLM model that whenever there's a change in M, it should affect the LM curve. It's going to shift. If there's a change in G or T, it should affect the IS curve. So by doing that, how do we get the relationship between Y and then P? That is what we want to look at now. Okay, so let's look at this. The B part, we are looking at relationship between price and the income. Okay, so if you go to the A, this is the ISLM model. This is our IS curve. This is our initial LM curve drawn for this particular P. So with this P, income was Y. So if you come to the AD curve, when price was P, income was Y. So now, just assuming we increase price, how does it affect income? So first, we need to go to the ISLM. Now, whenever there's an increase in price, there's a reduction in the real quantity of money. Remember now, P varies, and the real quantity of money is M over P. So holding the nominal quantity of money constant, whenever there's an increase in price, there's supposed to be a reduction in M over P. Okay, so remember in the money market, MS is supposed to be equal to MD. But here there's a reduction in MS, real MS. So we have excess demand for money. There's a reduction in the quantity of money, so there will be excess demand for money. So if you go to the bonds market, you'll be having excess supply of what? Bonds. So the price of bonds will fall, interest rate to what? Will go up. We remember that will cause the upward shift in the LM curve. So the LM curve will move from this to LM1. Okay, with that, we get the increase in interest rate. So this is going to be the new equilibrium. Income falls from Y to Y1. Why is income falling? Income is falling because after the increase in interest rates, investment will fall. And investment is a component of aggregate expenditure. So when aggregate expenditure falls, then income will also fall. So when we increase price, what has happened to income? Income has fallen from Y to Y prime. So when P increased from P to P prime, Y decreased from Y to Y prime. So when we join these 2 points, A and then A prime, then we are getting a downward sloping curve called the aggregate demand curve. And it's telling us about the relationship between price and then the output level. And because the curve is downward sloping, it means there's a negative relationship between price and then the output level. Whenever there's an increase in price, we should expect a reduction in output. And whenever there's a decrease in price, we should expect an increase in the output level. So this is how we derive the aggregate demand curve. Please, I hope we understand. Hello, please, do we understand?
Yes.
All right. So now we have our aggregate demand. Okay. So we start from the equilibrium conditions in both the goods and then the money markets, and then we've been able to.
Hello.
Yes.
Please, can you go back? I was trying to write something.
All right. Did you say you are writing something?
Yes.
About I'm sure you have it, right? Don't you have the slides?
No.
Oh, really?
Please, I'm done. I'm done.
All right. Right. So this is what I was saying. Looking at the aggregate demand, it means there's a negative relationship between the demand, aggregate demand, or the output level, and then the general price level. Whenever there's an increase in price, we should expect a decrease in output and vice versa. Okay. So this means that whenever there are changes in these policies, in the fiscal, the monetary, it will definitely affect the IS curve and then the LM curve. Then because of that, we'll be able to get a shift in the aggregate demand curve. There's no change in price, assuming there's no change in price at all, but then there's an increase in government spending. Remember, that's going to affect the IS curve. IS curve will shift to the right. At the same price, we'll see an increase in income, and that will result in a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So let's look at the shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Now we've seen that output is a function of real money balance, government spending, and then tax. Okay, so whenever there are changes in any of these variables, if there's a change in nominal money supply, there's a change in government spending, there's a change in tax, we should expect a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So for example, assuming we're starting from here at this point, so we're having price P and then income Y, and then there is an increase in government spending. If there's an increase in government spending, if you go by the ISLM model, the IS curve will shift to the right, okay, or it will shift upwards. So at the same price, we will see an increase in what? An increase in aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And this would mean that even at the same price level, there's an increase in what? An increase in Y. Okay, so any change in government spending, if it's an increase, it will move to the right. If it's a decrease, it will move to the left. And then if you take the nominal money, if there's an increase in the nominal money, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. If there's a decrease, it will shift to the left. If you take tax, whenever there's an increase in tax, the autonomous tax, the T0, the tax function, the autonomous tax, whenever there's an increase in tax, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. And then if there's a decrease, it's going to shift to the right. So these are the causes of shift in the AD schedule. Okay. So these are the components that will cause a shift in the aggregate demand. All right, so now let's add aggregate demand to AS, okay? And remember the AS, we said it could take several forms. It can be vertical, it can be horizontal, it can be upward sloping, okay? So first, let's look at how changes in aggregate demand that will be as a result of changes in the policies will affect output level and then price when the AS curve is vertical. We'll look at that. We'll look at the case where it is horizontal and then the upward sloping one. Okay. So now let's look at this. We have all the types here. The first AS0 is the fixed price model. So here we have a horizontal AS, a horizontal AS. Then for the vertical one, see, we have a vertical AS, that's AS2. And then the upward sloping one, we have AS1. And then these are initial aggregate demand curve. So this was the equilibrium. And then this aggregate demand was equal to all the AS at this point. So now we want to increase aggregate demand. Probably there's an expansionary fiscal or monetary policy that is causing aggregate demand to shift to the right. Okay, so now aggregate demand shifts to AD1. We want to look at the impact on price and then output. Let's look at the vertical one, AS2. If you look at this, after the increase in maybe government spending, AD shifted, and this is the new equilibrium at E2. What has happened to price? You see that price has increased, but then there's no change in Y. You see, there's no change in Y at all. Y doesn't change. If you look at the horizontal one, when there's an increase in or a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, we see what? We see a change in income. Income increase from Y0 to Y1, but there's no change in price. And then if you take the upward sloping one, there's an increase in price and there is an increase in income as well. So you see that the effects differ depending on the assumption that we are making about the AS curve. Okay, so we are not getting a consistent effect. So whatever we get will depend on whether AS is horizontal, vertical, or slopes upwards. Okay, or slopes upwards. So let's look at this. Let's look at the case where the AS curve is vertical. I'm sure you remember this. In the labor market, we have equilibrium in the labor market when the supply of labor is exactly equal to the demand for labor. Okay, this one, the curves are drawn as functions of real wage. Okay, as functions of real wage. So here at this equilibrium point, we get our N0, the equilibrium quantity of labor that will be hired in the labor market. So if you want to find the particular output level that will be produced based on this N0, you extend it to the product function. Okay, the production function, the product curve. Okay, so where it touches the curve, you trace it to Y, and then that is your Y0. Okay, this is your Y0. I'm sure we all remember this. Okay, what this means is that whenever there are changes in, assuming there's an increase in price, there was an assumption that wage could freely move. Okay, and if wage should increase, price should increase by 20%, we see wage also increasing by 20%, and as a result, there will be no change in the real wage. So if there's no change in real wage, there will be no change in N, and as a result, there will be no change in Y. That is why we're having the vertical AS curve. I'm sure we all understand this. You've already done this one. Okay, so even when P changes, W will change by the same proportion. So there will be no change in real wage. And if there's no change in real wage, there will be no change in N. And as a result, there will be no change in Y at all. That is why, if you look at this, when the AS curve was vertical, there was no change in Y, just the increase in price. Okay, Y didn't change at all because they assume that prices can freely move and the wage can also freely move. So whenever we allow wage to move, then we don't see any effect of changes in aggregate demand on the output level. So let's look at this example, the effect of an increase in government expenditure when we assume the vertical AS curve. let's start with the part A. Initially, this was the equilibrium point. Okay, this is our IS curve drawn with a particular value of government spending. This is our LM curve with our nominal supply of money and then the initial price level. Okay. So now, just assuming there's an increase in government spending. If there's an increase in government spending, we know that the IS curve is going to shift to the right. So IS curve shifts, and then the new equilibrium is going to be at point B. This equilibrium point B here, interest rate will go up, right? And then there's an increase in income from Y0 to Y1 prime, okay, Y1 prime. So if you come to the AS-AD curve, this is our vertical AS curve. This is our initial aggregate demand curve when there was no change in government spending. So the equilibrium point was A with output Y0. After the increase in government spending, IS curve shifts to the right, and we know aggregate demand will also shift to the right. So this would have been the new equilibrium point. Okay, this would have been the new equilibrium point. But because the AS curve is vertical, this is the equilibrium point, and we see an increase in price. The price has increased from P0 to P1 because of the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. It's like quantity isn't changing, but people are buying more, and it will put an upward pressure on price. So P1 will go up. So what is the effect of this increase in P1 in the ISLM model? When P1 goes up, there will be a reduction in real quantity of money. You see that initially this LM curve was drawn for M0 over P0, the initial price. But because there's an increase in price, it will necessitate the drawing of a new LM curve. How do we get that? Price has increased. Holding M0 constant, M0 over P1 will fall. Okay, so there's a reduction or a fall in the real quantity of money. So the LM curve will shift to the left. Okay, or it will shift upwards. So it will come and touch the new IS curve at point C. Okay, when it comes to this point C, interest rate is going up again. So investment will be falling, and then the income level will fall from that Y prime Y to the old Y. So Y prime will fall back to what? Y0, and it is happening at a higher price. So if we assume the vertical AS curve, whenever you increase government spending, it will only increase price without any change in the output level. Because after the increase in price, the real money balance will fall, LM curve will shift upwards, interest rate will go up, investment will fall, and then income will fall again. And then you see there's no change in the output level at all. Okay, there's no change in the output level. So this is the effect of an increase in government spending on the output level, and then price if we assume a vertical AS curve. Okay, if we assume a vertical AS curve. All right. So if you look at the analysis that we just did, it means that fiscal policy is totally ineffective. It doesn't affect the output level at all. It is just causing inflation. Okay, it's just causing the general price level to go up. Okay, so this is the effect of government spending on the AS-AD model when AS is assumed to be vertical. But then let's look at the contractual view of the labor market, what Keynes actually believed. According to the economic thoughts before Keynes, they were saying that wages could freely move. Okay, but then according to Keynes, wages do not move freely like that. According to him, for upward movement in wage, fine, it can move, but for downward movement, there's some rigidities. Workers will not just allow their wages to fall like that. So if that's the case, then it means that there's some difference between how things are going to be regarding the AS curve and then as compared to the vertical AS that we just looked at. So according to Keynes, the wage, the nominal wage cannot quickly adjust as we assumed earlier. So if it cannot adjust like that, then what is going to be the effect of that? But for him, he wasn't categorically stating that it cannot move at all. Fine, it's possible it can move, but then it cannot actually adjust 100% to the changes in price. So according to